Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you those of you that are here in person. This is our second talk in the semester where we're trying a new hybrid mode, and please forgive us if there are any glitches in the zooming of the seminar. I will be monitoring the chat and the questions at the end, and so we will let our speaker concentrate on his talk. We're very happy to be bringing Dimitris Xygalatas, who is a neighbor of ours. He's coming from Yukon in Stores, so we're happy to bring the local academics to campus finally, now that the COVID restrictions are over. And so we have quite a fascinating topic today, and I've been dying to bring Dimitris because there's so many overlaps with things that we do, or I do in the humanities mostly, and the wonderful bridge that his work has between anthropology and cognitive psychology, which will be part of what the talk is today, extreme rituals and social technologies. Dimitris' work is pioneering in bringing these two disciplines together. He has written extensively on extreme rituals, in Greece initially with the tradition of the fireworkers, but also internationally and comparatively, and works with a dedicated group that brings out a myriad of articles on the topic, which hope one day to read them all. He also has two books out. The first one is on the Anastasiades tradition in Greece. It's 2012. Title is The Burning Saints: Cognition and the Culture in the Firewalking Rituals of the Anastenaria. And then the next year, an edition with William McCorkle on mental structure, classical social theory, and the cognitive sciences of religion. I can go through the list of his articles that will keep us here for a while, only to say that the scope of his work covers things like sports culture as well, religion, the uses and psychology of ritual. So I hope we get a little bit of an ontology of everything today. So Dimitri, welcome. I will retreat, and the floor and the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. It's really nice to be here. I have been in a Hellenic Studies program before as a fellow at the one in Princeton, and I'm very happy to be able to visit another one. Είναι εύκολο να έχω ένα μπαλάκι νερό για να αρχίσουμε. I have to warn you that since I got COVID last January, I have this cough that comes and goes, so these days I might be coughing at some point. So don't worry, I'm not currently infected. This will stay with me for months. Now, this talk, I don't know if this thing is going to go away. Let's see if I can do something. Next. Never seen this before. I'm just going to hope that's going to go away. So this presentation is not, strictly speaking, on a Hellenic studies topic, or at least not only on a Hellenic studies topic, but I think it's a Hellenic story. It's a story that begins with me growing up in Thessaloniki. I lived there up until my college years, and I grew up on the far end of that picture, in the western suburb of Neapoli. Growing up in a working class family, my mother was a seamstress, and she was working from home. She was making clothes at home. And once a month, she would go to the city center, and she would take me with her to buy sewing supplies. And my reward for going with her was that we would go to this bookstore on Platea Aristotelos, which is just obscured by this annoying window over there. It's somewhere there. I don't know. It's not appearing on my screen. It's only appearing there. And I don't know if people can see it on Zoom.
I can see it, but
You can see it?
let's continue anyway.
So we try to do something about it? Let me just.
Yeah, I'm going to try to
restart
see
it.
if I can change. There you go. Put your file again. Okay, better.
Okay, let's go to this one. Yes.
Okay.
So once a month we go to the city center. We'll go to Malyaris Pede. That was the name of the bookstore. It was the biggest bookstore in Thessaloniki at the time, and the only bookstore that carried the English edition of National Geographic. And that's what I was after. So I was reading. Now, these are some of the issues that are still there in my library at my parents' house in Thessaloniki. And in those glossy pictures, that was the time before the internet, and there was no cable TV in Greece in the 80s. I would read about all of these faraway cultures and all of these seemingly exotic rituals, things like shamanic ceremonies in Peru, and the initiation rituals of certain African tribes where young boys would have to kill a lion to become initiated, or even places that were geographically closer to me, like the Sufi, the whirling dervishes in Turkey. But in my mind, these practices, they always seemed very far away, very exotic. They seem like relics of the past, something that people in Western society just don't do anymore. And so when I had this realization when I was, I don't know, maybe I was 12, maybe I was 14, when I saw a television report on the ritual on the left, and this pilgrimage that takes place in the Greek island of Tinos. People get off the boat, some of them, they'll be saving their whole lives to make this journey. They'll get off the boat and they'll get on their hands and knees and they will crawl up the hill to reach the temple of the Megalochai, the lady of Tinos. And it's quite a spectacle. You will see people with bruised and bloody elbows and knees. You will see old ladies faint under the midsummer sun, the day of the biggest day of celebration in that church is August 15th, which is traditionally the hottest day of the year in Greece. So people go through a lot of suffering in order to visit that icon that is said to be miracle working. So as soon as I saw this, I went, first chance I got, I went to my mother's village and I asked my grandfather, because he was a man of the church, he was the most religious person I knew, so he must know. So I asked him, Grandpa, do you know about this? Have you ever seen it? He says, of course I know about this. Such and such has done it actually, people from the village, people that I knew. And in that discussion, he came to mention other kinds of intense pilgrimages in Crete, and also the far-walking rituals of the Anastasia. So to me, that was a big realization. This is the sort of realization that every anthropologist has had, and also the sort of realization that the discipline of anthropology has had. That we start by marveling at the differences, how exotic other people's practices seem to be, and we soon reach the realization that we too have very similar practices, that at the end of the day, human beings everywhere, they are driven by the same needs and desires, and they express them in similar ways. They might differ superficially in their forms, but people around the world engage in very similar behaviors. So that was something that really stayed with me. And a few years later, when I went to college, I went to Aristotle University, and eventually decided to do a PhD in anthropology. I did that at Queen's University, Belfast. The first day I arrived there, we had a talk with my advisor, and I told him that what I wanted to study was the far-walking rituals of the Anastasia. And eventually, I submitted a proposal, it was approved, and I spent 16 months studying people in this little village in Greek Macedonia called Agia Eleni. And this is one of 5 villages where these rituals take place. These are groups of Orthodox Christians who fully follow the ritual and liturgical life of the Orthodox Church, but in addition to that, they have this other ritual cycle, which is addressed specifically to two saints, constantly and Helen. And the talk is not about the Ostensible, so I'm not going to go into the history of this group, but the reason they worship these two saints has to do with myths of origins, and it has to do with where these people came from. They call themselves refugees because their ancestors were refugees who came from the Black Sea coast of present-day Bulgaria. And that ritual cycle involves a lot of ceremonies and processions, and it culminates with this ceremony in May that is meant to honor these two saints, where people dance with the sacred icons of the saints. This is a dance that takes place for the better part of 3 days. There's a lot of exhaustion involved. People describe this not as a pleasant dance, but they feel it as, they describe it as strain and agony. Sometimes they seem to be fighting some invisible force. They might shout as they're dancing, they shout, no, no, no. They really seem to be suffering. And the culmination of those 3 days happens at the end of the third day when they go out, they take off their shoes, and they start dancing across a bed of burning embers. So I did what anthropologists do, and I started asking people why they perform these rituals. What I came to realize during my fieldwork with the Anastenaria was that meaning for the participation in those rituals comes through the act of participation itself. So people sometimes, we tend to think in various areas of psychology, for example, we tend to think that attitudes and beliefs cause behaviors, but a lot of what we do actually defines the way we think. And so our experience is fundamental to our personal and collective self and our autobiographical narrative and who we are as a group member. So what I saw is that these rituals, they served very important functions for the Anastenaria. They helped them soothe their anxieties, they helped them find social connection, and in some cases, they helped them find healing. So this woman, for example, she told me, I asked her why she participated in this ritual, and she told me that when she was young, she was sick, she was suffering from depression. They used to call it melancholia back in those days. And she said, I was sitting in my room staring at the window for 2 years, and there was no people. We thought there was no solution to this. Doctors at the time, pharmacological interventions were not very well developed for anxiety disorders. And one day, the Anastenaria went to her place and encouraged her to take part in this ceremony so that she would be saved. So, and in her narrative, in her life narrative, that's what happened. So she went and walked on fire and eventually was able to overcome her depression. Now, how does this happen? How does something like this happen? So in the course of this fieldwork, I realized that the story I was interested in exploring was not about the Anastenaria per se. It was a story about ritual more generally, but even more generally, it was a story about the things that make us human, but not the very obvious ones, not our pursuit of food and sex and shelter, not those things. The kinds of things that to an outsider might seem bizarre or might seem wasteful or irrational, things like music and sports affiliation, and for that matter, of course, things like ritual. But I was growing increasingly discontent by looking at, and because I was interacting, I was very lucky in my training and in the kinds of positions that I had as a postdoc and then as a faculty member. I got a lot of freedom, and I was able to interact with people from very different disciplines. And they were all interested in the human condition and the things that make us human. But I realized that they were studying those things from very different perspectives, and they never talked to each other. So you had people like anthropologists who go out in the field and conduct participant observation. They rely on phenomenological accounts. They rely on first-hand experience or their own interpretations. But they're not often very good at quantifying things, or they're not willing to quantify things. On the other hand, you have people in psychology departments who are used to studying human behavior in a laboratory. So they take people out of context, they bring them into this sterilized lab, and they conduct tests that, of course, give them a lot of control. And this is desirable. But when it comes to things that are full of meaning and are contextually very sensitive, sometimes it's impossible to take those things into the lab. So I thought, why not do the opposite? If instead of taking people out of context and moving them into a sterilized lab, why not try to move the lab into context by taking it into the field? And this is the kind of approach that I pursued ever since. And I'd like to give you a few examples of this approach. This, by the way, is a book that I wrote about these kinds of studies. It just came out last month. And it's about ritual more broadly. And the idea is that in order to understand any kind of phenomenon, we need to approach it from every possible angle. So we need to do our participant observation. We need to spend some serious time with people we're studying. I spent 4 years overall in my field sites. But we also need to bring measurement into our studies. So my first application of this kind of methodology was in this small Spanish village that is called San Pedro Enrique. After wrapping up my work with the Anastenaria, I went and spent 6 months in that little village and did ethnography there. And eventually, I was able to bring some measurements into the field. What happens in this village is very similar to what happens in Greece. As people gather, there's a whole festival that lasts for an entire week, and there are horse races and all sorts of other events. Trees are cut down and they're decorated in front of 3 houses, and those 3 houses become the hosts of the event, and 3 young girls become the hostesses. And on the day of the big event, which is the summer solstice, so on June 23rd, they built a big fire. 2 tons of oak wood are cut down for this fire to be built. As everybody gathers in the central square of the village. And that oak wood is used to build a fire that is stronger than any fire I've seen. I've seen fireworking rituals in many countries around the world. This fire, we measured it at almost 800 Celsius, over 1200 Fahrenheit. That's enough to melt aluminum. And on this fire, in front of this fire, people will gather, they will take off their shoes, they will pick up a person on their back, and they will cross these glowing coals. Now, this is a village of 600 people, and they built this amphitheater that can host 3,000 spectators, and it's only used once a year, only for this ritual. It is the most important event that happens anywhere in the area. Every single person I talked to, they confirm that this is of extreme importance to them, both for their personal and their collective identity. This is Fernando. Fernando that year was going to carry his girlfriend. Typically, you carry somebody you really care about, somebody who's very close to you. But they had a fight and she didn't show up. So right before he was going to cross the coals, he turned to his dad and said, "Dad, this year I'm going to carry you." And they all burst into tears. They hugged and they cried together, and then they went through the fire, and when he put him down, they cried again. This is the daughter of the local mayor at the time. And the mayor wrote a piece in the local newspaper, or gave an interview, where he said, "I've been the mayor for 22 years, but tonight is the most important night of my career." He says, "Not because I get to organize the festival for the last time, but because I get to carry my daughter across the fire."
Are these your photos, by the way?
Yes. And this is her with her sister crying after she's been carried through the fire by her dad. And this is another man there, Alejandro. Alejandro at the time was 76, I think, and he has been doing this for his entire life. Let's hope that the sound works here. I'll show you a video. Okay. Okay, let me replay it, and one thing there are subtitles, so I think
Let me try to mute this, and then you can use your sound. Do you want to do that?
Okay, then, yeah, let's do the work in the room.
¿Cree que alguna vez va a dejar de hacerlo?
Hombre, tiene que llegar ya. ¿Cuándo? Pues yo para no pasarla no tengo que subir al fuego, porque de la
Mute yourself again.
So what Alejandro is saying here is that if he goes up there and he has to watch it without being able to do it, he will kill himself. That's what he's saying. In fact, the following year, I was also in the village and I was going to see this ritual. And it just so happened that his doctor told him that he had seen some arrhythmia in his heart. So he banned him from doing the fireworking ritual. And true to his word, Alejandro said, I'm not going to go there because I just cannot watch without doing it. And on that night, I was in the central square. And what happens there is that people join hands and they form a chain and they march up to the venue. And I was holding hands with his son, Mamelo. And at some point he pulled me out of the chain. And I thought that was really weird. That was unexpected. I said, what's happening? He says, come with me. You'll see. So we went into his father's house. And his father was sitting in the kitchen watching television. So Mamelo stood in front of him and said, Dad, I know you cannot do the ritual. So I'm going to carry you through the fire myself. And again, his father was stunned. He just got up and started crying and hugged him. It was a very, very powerful moment. And we went up there, and in fact, Mamelo picked him up, carried him across the coals, put him down. And the moment he put him down, the old man, just as people were rushing to hug them, he signaled them to just stop. He turned around and crossed the fire himself. His wife didn't like that. Later that night, I asked him, what about your doctor's orders? What happened? You said you weren't going to do this. And he said, my doctor said something terrible might happen to my heart if I do the ritual. But does he know what would happen to my heart if I don't do the ritual? And this reminded me, I've heard the exact same thing from the Anastasia and from other rituals that I've studied. This is so meaningful to these people that they will often put their own lives at risk, even if they have some medical condition, in order to do it. And this is not unique. I've seen this in many different contexts. In my discussions with the people in San Pedro, I try to understand what it is that comes out. What are some of the implications of this ritual for the local community? And people kept referring to this idea of oneness, a sense of belonging. Some of them describe it as a feeling of electricity. You're there. It's a feeling that cannot be expressed in words. There's 3,000 people, but you feel like one. It's a sense of belonging. It's some said it's like an electrical current runs through you at that moment. It's this elation that cannot be put into words. And in this context, I thought this really reminded me of some classical anthropological observations. So the words of Emil Durkheim, specifically. Durkheim says the very fact of congregating is an exceptionally powerful stimulant. Once the individuals are gathered together, a sort of electricity is generated from their closeness. And that quickly launches them to an extraordinary height of exaltation. Their gestures and cries tend to fall into rhythm and regularity. So my participants have never read Durkheim, but sometimes they would use very similar language. And that got me thinking, what if we turn, this is a process that some philosophers have called front-loading phenomenology. The idea is that you take phenomenological experience, not for granted, but you take it seriously enough to turn it into a testable hypothesis. So if people say that they're if people suggest that they experience oneness and that their emotional reactions are aligned in this, in the context of this ritual. And if anthropologists have told us for 100 years that this happens, then how can we measure this? How can we measure this alignment of emotional reactions? So to do this, I put together a team, a very interdisciplinary team at Aarhus University, where I was at the time in Denmark. And we went to San Pedro and we brought some devices with us. We brought wearable heart rate monitors that would allow us to monitor people's emotional reactions. So we thought if Durkheim is right, and if what people are saying is right, then we should see that during this ritual, people's emotional reactions will begin to synchronize. They will be aligned. And in fact, what we saw is that there was a very high degree of synchrony. The graphs in the bottom are simply a way of quantifying synchrony, but you can also see it with the naked eye on top. So the blue line here is a firewalker, and the first vertical line is when his firewalk begins, and the red line is a spectator, his wife, who's watching. And you will see that as soon as the ritual begins, their heart rates are beginning to synchronize. The green line is an unrelated spectator. As I mentioned, this is a 600 people village, and 3,000 spectators arrive there every year. So there are a lot of people who are just curious tourists. They're not members of the group. The same does not hold for them. In fact, during the ceremony, we see that no matter what people are doing, I mean, obviously, if we all start dancing together, our heart rates are going to go up in the same time, right? And they're going to be dictated by our emotions. But in this context, some people are walking on fire, some are watching, others are preparing for their own walk. They're not doing the same thing, and yet their heart rates are synchronizing to a very high degree.
Is there music in the background?
Is what?
There music in the background?
There is music, but the music is, so there's a trumpet that plays at the beginning of each firework, and only there's a burst on the trumpet that signals the time to do the firework. But so I can see what you're thinking. That's a very good question to ask. But it's not the kind of music that's continuous, or that it would give them a sort of a beat that they can all align to. And if that were the case, then we would also expect the spectators to be equally synchronized. But here, what we see is a fundamentally communal phenomenon. It's a social phenomenon, because we see the outsiders don't display that synchrony, and we also map the social network of this village. So we asked everybody who their closest friends and relatives are. So we have measures of social proximity, and we can see that our measure of social proximity can predict the degree of physiological synchrony here. So it's only those who are already members of the group. And this is something that a lot of us might be able to relate to. And Durkheim himself indicated that collective effervescence, as he called it, is not merely generating emotions, but it brings those who share them into a more intimate and more dynamic relationship. So collective effervescence would be, if you've ever been in a football stadium with 30,000 people who are chanting together and jumping up and down together, and you feel goosebumps at the back of your neck, like what I feel when I go back to my home team stadium. Or if you march together with hundreds of thousands of people for a common cause, a public demonstration, for example, and that gave you goosebumps, that was the kind of, or in the context of a musical concert, perhaps. That's the kind of feeling that Durkheim has in mind. Now, I've been in bigger stadiums than my home teams. I've seen 60,000 to 65,000 people chanting together. I don't get goosebumps there. So it also takes a sense of group membership in order to get these effects of congregating. Now, after doing this study, I was thinking that I was obviously missing something very important, because I started with a social theory, and all I was able to measure was physiological responses. So what about human interactions? What about actual behaviors? And the need to do that is what brought me to Mauritius. And this is a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Most people have never heard of it. If you have, it might be because it's the home of the dodo, the first species to ever disappear in front of our eyes. But for me, the reason I chose Mauritius was that for an anthropologist of religion, it's a fascinating place because it's one of the most diverse societies in the world because of its really fascinating and unique history. It was the world's last sovereign country to be permanently settled by humans. And that happened through successive waves of colonization that brought initially slaves from all over Africa and later another form of forced labor indenture from all over Asia. So today you have Afro-Mauritians and Sino-Mauritians and Indo-Mauritians and a few white Mauritians, and you have Buddhists and Christians and Muslims. All of the major religions are represented there. About 50% of the population is Hindu. And all sorts of subgroups are also represented there. So there are a lot of Tamils. And this is one of the places that is cattle-born in inland that has one of the biggest Tamil populations, and it also has one of the most important temples for the Tamil community. And the reason I was interested in the Tamil community is that they perform some very high-intensity rituals. They also perform hard walking, but the ritual that brought me there specifically was the Taipusam Kavadi. Has anybody heard of that ritual? The Taipusam Kavadi? So Taipusam stands, it's the full moon of the month of Tai, the Tamil month of Tai. And Kavadi means burden. Now this is a ritual that is performed by Hindus in the southern state of Tamil Nadu and in Sri Lanka and wherever you find members of the Tamil diaspora, which is in many places, including places like Toronto and New York. The Kavadi is performed in honor of Lord Murugan. And there's a legend that connects Murugan to this occasion where he fought an evil demon. What happened was that Shiva was tricked by an evil demon called Surapadra into giving him, essentially making him immortal. The only person who could vanquish him would be Shiva's child, but Shiva was childless. So that was a problem. And that allowed this demon to take the gods hostages and rule over the world. So a number of Hindu deities conspired to engage in a matchmaking event between Shiva and his wife Parvati, who eventually begot Murugan and then gave him a spear by which he was able to subdue this evil demon. So the iconography of this ritual is related to this event. And by the way, the demon, eventually he spared the demon's life and turned him into a peacock, which he used to go around the world. And you can see it in the iconography here. The peacock and the spear are very powerful symbols of Murugan. And to honor this occasion, Tamils perform one of the most intense and one of the most widely performed rituals in all the world. It starts by building a kavadi. This is the kavadi, it's a miniature shrine that is decorated with flowers and peacock feathers, and it has offerings for the deity. And there's a very long procession, it's a pilgrimage, where people meet at a riverbank and they perform these purification ceremonies. And then they take those shrines on their shoulders and they will carry them for the better part of the day, maybe 6 hours, under the midsummer tropical sun. This happens in January, February, in the southern hemisphere, where it can be brutally hot. But this is only a small part of the hardships that they need to experience. Because before they do this, before they embark on this pilgrimage, they will have their body pierced with metallic objects. And it's a very spectacular ceremony. And on this day, there are about 100 temples in Mauritius who have a procession. So on this day, it's impossible to go anywhere without coming across one of those processions. It's a massive pilgrimage. But before they embark on this pilgrimage, people will have their body pierced. Some of them by one needle. Now, if this image bothers you, I'll have to warn you that it's going to get much worse. So you're hereby warned. Some people have one piercing. Women typically have one needle through the tongue or just a scarf. This symbolizes and, of course, enforces a vow of silence. during the procession. Some people have numerous piercings on their forehead, across the tongue and cheeks, and some can have spears impaled through their cheeks. Some people have hundreds of needles. I once talked to this kid, he must have been about 14, and he was coming back from the temple. I asked him, how many needles did you have? And he said 500. And I thought, there's no way, there's not enough skin on you to have 500 needles. And I asked again, he said, no, 500. And I thought, this is a language issue, so I asked him in French. And he says 500, so 500, 500. And he turned around and he showed me his back, which was completely perforated by these small holes, each one of them having a tiny drop of blood. People might have, the most we have counted on someone was 600, actually. The entire body, except for the genitals, might be covered entirely by needles. And there's worse. Because some people will have something like this, big rods the size of broomsticks impaled through their cheeks. And you might notice that this gentleman, on his back, there are hooks attached to his skin. And by these hooks, they're going to drag these large chariots. This little girl is plugging her ears because people are starting to shout and cry. And this is very, every time I see this, I've seen this dozens of times, but it still hurts my stomach. And the sound is one of the things that you come to associate with it. It's usually the women who cry. The men try to be brave, of course, they cry, they suffer, but they try to suppress it. But the women who accompany them, their mothers, their spouses, their daughters, they cry and scream. Now, some of them will even drag large chariots by these hooks that are attached to their skin. And these chariots, they can be so large that sometimes people have to walk ahead of them with big bamboo sticks to lift the electricity wires so they can pass underneath. I've seen somebody who was dragging because Murugan is the lord of the mountains, somebody was dragging something similar to this, so a mountain that had live animals planted on it. Live plants, live trees planted on it. There were coconut trees on that structure, and he was pulling it with his skin. So when they reached the temple of Murugan, now the last part of the hardship is that, and by the way, walking barefoot is one way of doing it, but this is another way of doing it. And I don't know which one is worse, because for me, under the midsummer tropical sun in Mauritius, it's impossible to take a single step to touch the asphalt. It's extremely burning. And when they reach the temple, then they have to climb 242 steps up the hill, and they carry their burden with them. Obviously, the chariot cannot go up, but everything else goes up. These burdens, these kavadis, sometimes they can reach up to 60 or 80 kilograms. Excuse me.
The anastenaria looks like a joke in front of them.
It is several hours of self-imposed torture. There's no other way to put it. So in this context, I thought this was the perfect context for me to explore what I wanted. Because when you do field studies, you cannot manipulate your variables like you do in the lab. You have no control. The best you can hope for is that you can find some naturally occurring variables that you can build a study around them. Now, when we ask people why they do this, and I've interviewed hundreds of people about the Kavadi ritual, their answers tend to cluster around certain themes. So some of the biggest themes, people will talk a lot about tradition. This is just the way we've done it. They also talk about community, how this helps them bond with others. Obviously, they talk about their devotion. It's an act of devotion. And they also tend to talk about this concept of a promise, which is very similar to what happens in Tinos and Alban pilgrimages. They make this promise to the deity, and they're hoping to get something in return. So it can be retrospective. It can be to thank the deity for some good fortune that they've had, or it can be to request a favor, and that favor could be for their kids to pass the exam to enter university. That's a big one in Mauritius. Mauritian Hindus are very, very fond of education for their children. And another common theme was illness and healing, which is another similarity we see with other kinds of pilgrimages. And I've asked people also why they perform and what they expect to get out of other kinds of rituals. And we see that this, for problems that are stronger, for illnesses that are more difficult or more serious, they will turn to this more intense ritual. So people might engage in prayer, in their morning prayer, in order to stay well, but they'll do the kavadi to get well. It's kind of the analogy between a healthy diet and medicine. So this is the medicine. So in this context, we organized a study to see whether this notion of community, pro-sociality, whether we can say something about it, whether we can measure it, whether we can see the effects of performing this ritual on becoming more bonded with the community. So in this context, we invited people to fill in a short survey where we asked them about their experience, how painful it was for them, and some basic demographics. And after that, we paid them for their participation, and we thanked them, and we let them go. But right outside the temple, there's a person, a local collaborator working with us, who is asking them whether they would like to donate some money to a charity, to a local charity. So we observe how people behave after performing this ritual, and we compare this to what they do after performing other types of rituals or what they do outside of any ritual context. And what we see is that on the left here, people in all kinds of random situations unrelated to any ritual context or any religious context, they gave 57 rupees on average. Those who attended a collective prayer that involved chanting for a couple of hours, that was done at the same temple by the same people from the same group, the same population, in the context of the same festival, just on another day. And in comparison to them, those who take part in the kavadi, they give much more. And not just those who suffer physically, but even those who vicariously suffer by walking alongside their loved ones and seeing them suffer. So the levels of donation between those two groups are actually statistically similar. There's no statistical difference between those two groups. So similar to what we see in Spain, that vicarious suffering is very important in bringing those people into community. And we also see that the more people suffer, the higher their donations. And this is in accordance with certain theories of ritual that look at ritual and say that engaging in a ritual actively creates commitment to that community, but it also signals commitment. It communicates. It's an act of communication, which raises the status of the participant. Ellie Power, for example, has done beautiful work in India, studying similar rituals there, where she showed that the status of an individual and their social support network strengthens the more they perform these rituals. And taking part in the kavadi once is the equivalent of going to the temple once a week for the entire year in terms of their increase in status that they provide. But in one study we did, we also wanted to see how these kinds of costs and benefits might differ within the context of a ritual. How they might differ between people of different classes, different socioeconomic statuses. And we looked at two ways of signaling devotion in the context of this ritual. One is by engaging in those piercings, and the other one is based on the kavadi that you carry. So in the context of this ritual, we measured the size of the kavadi that people carried, and we also measured the number of needles they put in their body. And we conducted measurements of socioeconomic status, multi-item measurements. We looked at years of education, we looked at the languages they spoke, we looked at the mobile and immobile property that they owned, we looked at perceived prestige and so on and so forth, and we collapsed all of these into a single factor. And what we found is that there are two main modalities of signal and commitment in this ritual. Those of higher socioeconomic status, they carry larger cavadis. At first that surprised us. We thought it was going to be the opposite. But then when we looked at the weight of those cavadis, we found that those cavadis are not necessarily heavier. What happens is that wealthier individuals are able to spend financial capital to buy better materials. So instead of iron, they buy aluminum. Instead of wood, they buy bamboo. So they'll build a bigger cavadi that is not actually heavier. Now, those of low socioeconomic status, we see that they perform the cavadi more times across their lifetime. They have way more piercings in their body, and they spend more hours building their cavadis. So in the absence of financial capital, they use the only capital they have, their own body, literally their own blood, sweat, and tears, in order to signal their commitment. All of that is something you can actually see ethnographically. You can see with your eyes. Now, it's good to measure those things, but as an ethnographer, having spent all this time in Mauritius, I can use other ways of describing the same phenomenon. For example, one year I was invited. I met the Minister of Education in the context of this ritual. He was taking part in this ritual. He only had one piercing, and he carried a small cavity. And as we chatted afterwards, he invited me to his home for dinner. And I was very impressed. I thought, oh, I'm going to meet one of the highest ranking members of the Mauritian government. Maybe I can pitch some ideas for collaboration. Maybe we'll establish some memorandum of understanding. Who knows who's going to be there? Maybe the Prime Minister will be there. I arrived at the dinner, brought a bottle of wine, didn't know what to expect. Sometimes in Anthropology we speak of cultural shock. There were 1,500 people at this. The way it works is that you walk in, there's this central yard, as it happens in the Mauritian extended family house, obviously a very affluent household, with catering and waiters. You shake hands with your host, and then you take a seat, you wait for a spot on one of the tables, you eat. As soon as you finish your meal, you're on your way you're out to make way for other guests. So you see that the most affluent members of the community can do this. They don't need to have to put 500 needles in their body. They can feed the entire village. Some people come out of their homes, and that's another way where you see the prosociality, the boost in prosociality. On the day of the cavadi, everybody becomes more prosocial. People open their homes and they pour water on the feet of the pilgrims to soothe their feet, and they give free food and drinks to the pilgrims. Cannot eat anything, but to everybody else. But those who are more affluent, they might rent a hydrant, a water truck, to pour water on the street for everybody, for hundreds of feet. So there's these very different forms of modality, and that's why you also see that those of the upper classes, they're very protective of their privilege in the context of this ritual. So when I asked high status individuals, Brahmins or members of the temple community or very affluent individuals of this society, if you ask them, what does it mean to have many piercings? How many piercings should one have during this ritual? They'll say, no, one is enough. Those who have too many, they're show-offs. Now, if you ask people who don't have the financial means to host a dinner for 1,500 people, they'll say, the more the better. Somebody who has 500 needles in their body, that shows that they're a more devoted person. So these individuals, they have to work harder to get the same kind of recognition, the same kind of status. Or at least they have to use a different form of capital to achieve that. And one final study that I'd like to mention is related to what people told me in the Ostenaria in the first place. So just like I saw with the Ostenaria, in Mauritius too, people often refer to health and healing as a justification for doing this ritual. And it seems that it's particularly people who suffer from mental illness. that turn to this ritual for healing. Now, pretty much everybody goes to this ritual, but people have come up with different reasons. Those who state illness, they're obviously you don't perform a pilgrimage to heal your broken bone. It's typically things like anxiety disorders. In the context of this ritual, we conducted a study where we followed people for 2 months, and we followed participants in the committee and a control group. And you might notice that this gentleman has this tiny device under the scarf on his left arm. And the reason you can see it now is because it's been raining, so it's wet. But this measures the amount of stress involved. So it measures electrothermal activity. So we can see how much effort they put into this ritual. And over a period of 2 months, we monitored their subjective well-being, their quality of life, but we also measured their physiological reactions during the ritual. And we measured the cost of the ritual, one by measuring the number of needles they had in their bodies, and two by looking at their stress levels during the ritual. And needless to say, their stress levels during the ritual are orders of magnitude higher than anything else they would encounter in their everyday life. It's an extremely stressful ritual. There's a lot of suffering. People sometimes have asked me whether there's a masochistic aspect to these rituals. And my answer is clearly no. Nobody has ever told me that they take pleasure in participating in this ritual. They will describe this as a sacrifice, as an act of suffering, something they have to endure to get to where they want to get. So in this context, we see that after the ritual, people's sense of well-being and quality of life 1 month after the ritual is significantly increased compared to a month before the ritual. And this is not random. It's proportional to the amount of suffering that took place during the ritual. So both the number of piercings that they had in their body and their stress levels as measured by electrodermal activity, they are predictors of that increase. So the more you suffer, the more pain, the more gain in the context of this ritual. Exactly. Now, how does this happen? Obviously not through some kind of magical causation, but rituals are very successful social technologies because they're able to harness all kinds of evolved psychological predispositions and different kinds of mechanisms. So at the psychological level, of course, they create expectations. The woman I showed you from the Australia went into this ritual with the hope of getting healed. That's a big part of when you're suffering from an anxiety disorder. Hope is a big part that is very easy to lose. Physiologically, those rituals, they stimulate the production of dopamine in the brain or the production of endorphins. And those things, there are studies that show that exercise can be just as effective as pharmacological interventions for depression and anxiety disorders. The problem being that when you're depressed, the last thing you want to do is get out. So these rituals create a different kind of incentive, a social incentive to go out and socialize with individuals. And most importantly, perhaps, they create, as we see in all our studies, they create social support networks. There are studies that show that people who have tighter social support networks are better able to deal with anxiety. They even have lower blood pressure. When you have somebody to turn to in times of need, in times of stress, you might want to call it a free therapist. You might want to call it something else, but we know from various lines of research that social support networks are fundamentally important for anxiety disorders. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a kumbaya approach to a ritual and that it's all good and that performing these rituals will help you fix everything in your life. I tend to see rituals as social technologies. And as all technologies, they can be used for better and for worse. So when we think of collective effervescence, when we think of the strong bonding effects that some rituals can have, we cannot overlook what kinds of similar effects they would have had for, let's say, the Nazis when they marched in their large parades, or the way they're used by military and paramilitary groups, specifically as social engineering tools to increase social cohesion. And we also cannot overlook when we think of what's happening in football stadiums, for example, when the way people form these very strong identities. Where I come from, people often are willing to risk their lives or be killed for their team. Actually, I was almost killed once, just for walking in the wrong neighborhood, wearing the wrong scarf at the wrong time. So I was in Athens when I was 17, wearing my home team's scarf, and I was attacked by a group of people who threw me on the ground, punching and kicking. I ended up in the hospital, and I always wonder what would have happened. Stabbings are very common. This year in my hometown, a kid was killed just because he was wearing the wrong color shirt. Eventually, supporters of my own team, saw that and intervened to chase these guys away. How do you get from different colored T-shirts to something like this, to being able to risk your life? In Greece, there are teams that have brotherhoods. It's actually sisterhoods because the word's feminine, with teams in other countries. There have been incidents where supporters of one team traveled to the other country to engage in street fights with their friends' enemies in that other country. Those teams, what they have in common is that they have the same colors. They begin this pact because they have the same colors, and at some point, something happens that it devolves into this. I would argue that there's never been a couch potato hooligan. These extremely strong identities that you see in groups of hooligans, in groups of terrorists, in military groups, in paramilitary groups, and of course even in religious groups or groups of college students or wherever other group it is. Those kinds of strong identities are forged during these in-person interactions that are highly ritualized. In some of my recent research, we look at sports fans. We've been following Husky fans at UConn for an entire year. And we measure their physiology, and we also measure their social sentiments and their experience of the game. And we see that watching a game in person in a group compared to watching the same game in person on television creates stronger heart rate synchrony. And that predicts people's experience of the game. They feel that they've had a much more meaningful and transformative experience. And that predicts how bonded they feel with other group members. So I think that by looking at ritual and by looking at these ritualized behaviors, the collective behaviors that occur in all kinds of other settings, we can learn a lot of important things about our own nature and our own species. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll take some questions.
Great.
Apologies for coughing.
Yes. Thank you, Dimitri. I hope you can hear me. And this is George Sedemes. I'm getting an echo. I will see if I can do this without my microphone here. I will be reading out the questions and conduct a little bit the conversation here. I'm going to give Lauren Danforth the first question because I don't necessarily need to share the screen because I would be. Maybe you can exit your full screen. So Lauren Danforth has sent us a question earlier, so I'm going to give Lauren the first question. In your earlier work on fire walking in Greece, you make use of the cognitive science approaches involving cortical activity and brain chemistry. Doesn't this theoretical perspective require that you conduct biological and neurological studies of the people involved in the ritual so that your empirical data and your theoretical approach are consistent and your analysis is coherent? That's the first part.
So let me take this.
Yes.
So thank you very much for this question. The answer is yes, it does. And so I'm happy to have given this talk because in my subsequent work, that was exactly something that I realized was missing. And I've been doing these biological measurements for the 15 years.
And some of the images you showed us your...
Some of this work that I discussed are of that nature, but I've also done lab work and field work. And my perspective is that any single study, any single approach has of course, has its limitations. So in my ethnography, I relied on my own interpretation. I brought in cognitive theories, and I posed some hypotheses. And from there, my next step was to try to test these hypotheses, each one in the most appropriate ways. And also, I talked about bringing the lab into the field, and I think the paradigm that I'm proposing goes beyond that. It also involves going back and forth between the lab and the field. So there are things that participant observation can tell you that no quantitative study could ever tell you, and vice versa. So when we're looking at specific mechanisms, for example, we did a study in the lab when we wanted to see whether synchronized movement of the kind that you see in many rituals when people dance together and they sing together, does that actually increase the production of endorphins? It turns out that it does. Now, does that increase in endorphins predict trust? And we see that it does by using both self-reports and economic gains. Now, this is not a study that you can do in the context of a firewalking ritual. So by moving back and forth between the lab and the field, I think we can answer these questions, and that's exactly what we've been trying to do. So I agree with Laura.
To follow up on that.
Can I read his second part? There's a second part of the question. I don't want to deviate, and then you have the next one, all right? The second part has to do with how we bring our values to the field, and Lauren writes, you have described firewalking in Greece as a, quote, waste of valuable resources, non-rational and ineffective, unquote. What criteria are these apparently ethnocentric value judgments based on? How would people who perform this ritual respond to these descriptions?
Mm-hmm. So I've never made this claim. So what I say is that rituals seems irrational. I just published a book, and the subtitle of that book is How Seemingly Senseless Acts Make Life Worth Living. So that kind of gives away my perspective, right? From the perspective of an outsider, any ritual seems bizarre. If we look at the rituals of the opening of the British Parliament, they seem utterly ridiculous to us. But to a British person, they convey gravitas and they convey all sorts of other things. So, and although ritual in itself, that's the definition of a ritual. The definition of a ritual is that it lacks direct utility. That does not mean that it doesn't have a function and it doesn't have a utility at all. It might lack direct utility, so it might be seemingly wasteful. But my entire research, my 20-something years, I've been working on identifying and measuring and demonstrating these functions in the value of ritual. So yeah, I don't think that's a fair description.
I do have a thought, just a quick one.
Tell us your name too.
David Rosenbluth. But are there any animal models for this? So examples of extreme rituals in the animal kingdom that would perform this similar function?
Right. So
Social animals.
yes, there's. We are the most ritualized of all species, but of course, we're part of nature, and ritual is something that we find across nature. There are obvious similarities here between bird rituals. Of course, we're phylogenetically more removed from those animals. If we look at our closest relatives, we'll see that their rituals begin to resemble ours more and more. For example, chimps and bonobos and other primates, they might have things like greeting rituals. And some of the greeting rituals actually closely resemble to those that you find in some human societies. There's in a recent paper, it was reported that bonobos have scrotum clasping rituals, which is exactly what it sounds like. Now, there's an example of a human culture, an indigenous culture in Australia that had the same type of ritual. The idea behind this being that just like when we shake hands, we kind of make ourselves vulnerable and it's a signal of trust, a similar thing can happen with other kinds of rituals. There are also the types of rituals so Jane Goodall described a behavior among chimps that she called a waterfall dance. So chimps, they seem to be at awe when they encounter a waterfall and they engage in this collective dance of sorts. And more recently, a group of people at the Max Planck Institute, they set up cameras in various parts of West Africa, and they observed chimpanzees visiting these trees. Now, we have to be very careful when we describe animal behavior to avoid attributing intentions that are not there. But if we saw this in humans, we would clearly say that these are sacred trees, and those behaviors are rituals. What the chimps do is that they'll get out of their way. When they're traveling, they'll actually intentionally visit those trees, and they drum on them, and they carry rocks that they use to drum on them, and sometimes they pile those rocks either inside the tree or in front of the tree. So they make these currents, like we find in other human societies. One last example is elephants. That they seem to have mourning rituals. They seem to have an understanding of death, so they will travel to visit the bones of their ancestors, especially if it's a matriarch, a socially important member of the group. And they will fall silent, and then they will trumpet all together. Very similar to what people do at wakes and funerals. So there are definitely a lot of parallels with the animal world.
Can I follow up on this topic? And since we're talking about chimpanzees, I'm not quite sure which species of this family of mammals is that kills occasionally the weakest male. Collectively, the males attack and kill one of their own, usually the weakest. And it doesn't seem to have any function other than to reestablish the hierarchies, because this particular member is not a threat to the community. So is that something we would call a proto-ritual of sorts, where it establishes other a symbolic order that involves, in this case, a very extreme expulsion of a particular member?
I guess it would have to be context specific here. So I would want to know more about the context. So there are human practices that might resemble this. So human sacrifice, for one, or in many cultures traditionally there have been practices like infanticide, which have served a specific function. So when there's not enough resources to make sure that every offspring will survive, you might want to make sure that at least some of them will survive. But I don't know the context of what
my source is David Attenborough, and I can probably look for it. Okay.
So we certainly know that chimps, for example, they engage in warfare. And they often kill each other. But I don't know whether killing the weakest link is I don't know the context of that.
Yeah, I'm going to let anybody else who has questions. I have one or two myself, but I want to see if anybody else does. And I don't have another one from the Zoom. Oh, here's one. Okay. Somebody has a comment. I don't know if you want to respond to this. I think this is from Mark Kuschak. Forgive me if I mispronounce your names. I think this might work in silence as well. Having meditated for some time, I had the chance to participate in a group meditation event, which I felt to be significantly more intense. So are there more sort of passive rituals that don't involve these extreme bodily manipulations?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It relates to something I've been discussing with a graduate student recently. So there are a lot of things to say here. So the first thing to say is that there are a lot of meditative traditions, from Gregory Palamas and the Xygalatas tradition to some of the Sufi practices, that some of them can involve very high arousal, and some of them can actually involve absolute silence and meditation. And the interesting thing is that sometimes you see that, phenomenologically speaking, people report very similar experiences from those too. So it seems that somehow hyperarousal and hypoarousal might lead to the same phenomenological experience. Now, how does that happen? I don't know. Another point to make here is that I've been recently wondering, because I'm having these discussions with a student who works with, she's an audiologist, who works with deaf individuals. So we've been wondering, how would that a high-intensity ritual among deaf individuals, how would that work if it relies only in other kinds of senses? Let's say drumming, for example. So if you were able to engage in a high-intensity or dancing ritual without the auditory feedback, would that be the same kind of experience? I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer here, but it's a very fascinating question that we might pursue.
I want to kind of, Maria, you have a question. Go ahead. No, please go ahead. No.
So thank you, Dimitri. It was a very interesting topic. Yeah, I have two questions. You mentioned that this is an act of bonding, yeah, that makes us one community, oneness. I was wondering about those people who do not want to participate in those extreme rituals. Are they excluded from the community? How do they really create this belonging, this community? I'm wondering about the idea of the community here, because the community is people who do these rituals and people who do not want or can or whatever.
Talking about the observers.
It can be the observers in a way, yeah, observe, participate.
The tourist observer.
And this would be actually also my next question, exactly. This is a segue to my next question. I've been to the Anastenaria in North Greece. I may have been 10, 12 years old, and I will never forget it, I think, until the end of my life, what I've seen. But also I want to ask you if this is now a part of a tourist, more touristy production, in addition to this community bonding that you say. There are more criteria now. I was there as a tourist, yeah, with my family, and yes, it left an indelible image in my mind, but I'm not in any way in a community with these people, right? Yes, so the idea of the community and the exclusion of people who do not want or can participate in those extreme rituals.
So let me start with picking up one aspect of what you said. And a lot of the sacrality of a ritual can vary because of various sort of socio-historical circumstances. So as far as the Anastenaria go, certainly the people of Agia Eleni, it's a very, very sacred ritual of theirs. So tourists are certainly there, and they're welcome, or at least they're tolerated, or well, they're welcome to watch. But it comes with an expectation that they will respect the ritual. Sometimes these tourists might try to engage in the ritual, take part. And I've seen there was this one instance where I was in the Konaki, the room where this takes place, and there was a girl. She's already been coming for a while, and she's watching this. And once the lyre starts playing, everybody becomes pensive and sad because the lyrics are connected to the lost homeland. And there's a lot to say here about the semantics of this music. But then when the drum kicks in, you can really feel it in your stomach. So for me, who I'm not an insider there, I can still feel that when this music is playing, I can really get how somebody who's susceptible might start swinging and eventually start dancing. So there's this young girl, possibly a college student, I don't know. Just by looking at her, I could see she was out of place. She was chewing a gum. She was not dressed for the occasion. And when everybody starts swinging, she starts swinging in a little bit of a different way, a little bit like. So you could see it was more of an entertainment for her. And there's this old lady, the eldest of the group at the time. She was dancing and she was carrying the icon and she was in the zone in the moment. And at some point she stops. She looks at that girl and she says, "Why are you moving about? Stop it right now. Oristabas." And she just froze at her feet. And a few hours later she tried to do it again. They started swinging. And the lady again stopped the ritual and looked at her and said, "What did I tell you? Stop that. This is not your place." Right? So you have to know where the boundaries are drawn. Also in Spain, everybody's welcome to watch, but only the locals can do it.
Yeah. Right, but from the locals, still there are people who do not do it. So,
yes,
right?
so that's the other part.
One is the viewers, audience.
So my answer to this would be that in many small-scale societies, in tribal societies, a lot of them it would be impossible to not do the ritual. So depending on the kind of ritual. Like if you're not willing to undergo circumcision, for example, especially for females, rituals that are forced upon them, they might not be able to marry, have children, be part of that community. Sometimes you might face ostracism if you don't do those rituals. But for this to work or even to exist, I think can only exist in very insular societies, because in the kinds of societies that I've studied these rituals, people are more interconnected. They have more than one social network. So they're not necessarily excluded if they don't perform this one ritual, because they also have these other circles that they're part of. Historically, I think you're right. A lot of these high-intensity rituals would be a requirement for group membership, and there will be a function to this. So showing that you're willing to undergo this ordeal also shows your commitment to the community.
Perhaps I can build a little bit on Maria's question. I mean, we do have a historical anecdote of this, of how the Spartans, during their demise, during the Roman periods, they would keep their traditions, but mostly to entertain Roman tourists who would, come to Sparta to watch adolescent boys naked thrashing each other, which was part of the way that it became, dedicated killing machines of the state. But I think the question, since these rituals seem to be such a strong identity bonding process, all identities are exclusive anyway, so communities need to define their borders. And obviously that woman in Anastasia, they said, you? No. Right? So I want to kind of turn the question to something a little bit more problematic for us now.
Can I, before you do that, because I have something else to say here. So in various contexts I've seen, not in the Anastasia, but not in the Anastasia or Yelena, but I've seen this in Bulgaria, for example, where there was a sort of a schism, and there are very few, there's less than a handful. By now it might be one or two individuals, with some of the elders having died. Some of the Nestinari, so at the place where this ritual originally comes from, this was a mixed population, though it's in the Black Sea coast. So there is it's still performed in Bulgaria. Actually, I don't know if it's still performed, because when I visited the Nestinari in 2006, 2007, it was only 3 or 4 individuals who were actually doing this as a sacred ritual. There was another group of younger people who were doing it, performing for the tourists. And you could clearly see that this was not okay for the elders who would take it seriously. But there are also cases where, and I can think of a couple of cases. So in Mauritius, there's this dance called Sega. It's a Mauritian dance which evolved among African slaves as an act of resilience and defiance. And you have similar instances with capoeira or other kinds of dances in Jamaica among enslaved populations. And both in Mauritius and in Jamaica, as it was brought to my attention by one of my undergraduate students, you have the same people might be performing this ritualized dance on their own and treat it as something very sacred. And on occasion, they might perform the same kind of dance for the tourists because they need to make a living. But they draw a distinction between those two types of performances. Again, this is not what happened to the Anastasia, but sometimes you might see this as sort of the secular world encroaches on the sacred.
Yes. I'm going to switch to my art critic mode now and basically pose the question. I have 2 questions. One has to do with the way that in traditions go back to antiquity, art was the medium by which you establish these communal identities, right? And also build the rituals. I'm talking about theater, right? And the way that Aristotle saw this as a communal event of purging, and later on we get the term catharsis. In the 19th century, Nietzsche discovers this tradition and calls for this infusion of Dionysiac elements into art, whereby we virtually have these experiences without ourselves suffering, right? So there's already kind of in our understanding of how art works, something akin to these rituals that seem to be demanding the presence of the body and the use of the body much more. And I'm going to ask forgiveness from Michael Herzfeld, whose class I took once in my graduate years, because I stayed with one phrase he said: common sense is rarely common and even more rarely sensible. And so this also addresses Lauren Danforth's critique of ethnocentric biases that we may bring to work. So I'm going to ask something closer to our world, because it doesn't make sense to me. It's not very common among us we'd like to believe, but it seems to be very common throughout culture, which is hazing. And hazing is an act that happens to an individual who voluntarily joins a group and is subjected to all sorts of tests. Is that something that we can anthropologically extract from the bracket of ethics and say this is just a subculture of colleges, and who are we to impose our I don't know, bourgeois ethics on what is essentially a male bonding experience that in many cultures we see as detrimental to the physical integrity of the individual, but yet in other cultures we cannot stand back and say we cannot judge, but we judge here.
Yeah.
So what would be your take if you were in a committee of the university that has to work with Greek life on campus? Not our Greek life, but campus. So I mean, how do we deal with this question when it comes to things closer to home? Can this model work, and would you defend it? Would you say let them do it because that's how they become bros? Brotherhood is built through ritualized violence, and it's not. Sometimes it's hard to tell where the ritual ends and where violence really begins. And a lot of these, I don't know if these men who pierce themselves get infections, for instance. We also don't seem to have women in those rituals, right?
There are women, but they never engage in those very intense forms.
So I mean, I don't think you don't need to respond to the sort of how art may work for us, because clearly we watch a play differently than we would if we watched it alone at home, right? Or a comedy for that matter. So it doesn't need to be a kind of a traumatic experience. It can also be a happy one, and we're happier with other happy people. But what about hazing and fraternities?
So that's a big question. I'm not a moral relativist. I don't feel comfortable with moral relativist. A lot of times I ask my students, do you agree that every culture should be respected? And of course, you want to say yes, right? And they look at me and say, okay, this is a trick question. We know something's going on. And I go, yes. And then I say, what about the Nazis? Which is the ultimate example. So there are always boundaries, but they're very fuzzy. Every anthropologist has struggled with this. When we see things like animal sacrifice, where the animal is actually intended to suffer. For the animal, for the right to be performed properly, the animal has to suffer. That's all easy to watch. To things that are that involve the mistreatment of humans, how do we react? There's no clear line because morality is not somewhere written up there in stone, right? It also varies between cultures, between individuals. I cannot defend female genital mutilation. There's no way. Of course, I'm going to judge it. I've been lucky enough as an anthropologist to always study voluntarily performed rituals. So the people who do the body piercings, people who do the firewalking in Australia, and in Spain, they all do it of their own will. If I had seen a child being pierced against their will, I mean, obviously I would judge that. Now, how do you handle this as an anthropologist in the field? That's a whole other discussion. Which, again, I've been lucky enough to not be in that position. And when it comes to if I were in that committee, now this is a really difficult question. If I'm in that committee and I have to decide about hazing rituals, I guess it has to be a case-per-case basis. So you have to allow for some team building potential in those rituals by using arousal or intensity in forms that actually don't become torture, that don't become risky or dangerous. I also have to say that it's one thing to undergo a stressful or even painful initiation ceremony in the context of your tradition and in the presence of your elders and your brothers and your cohort. It's another thing to be hazed by a sophomore that you met yesterday. Right? So taking these things out of their context.
But this is a place where communities and identities are formed all the time. In fact, the whole 4 years is one big ritual of identity, which includes a lot of suffering too.
Yeah, of course. We say about
mental stress, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I don't think we can say that they're not building a community because they just met. I mean, communities need to be created anyway.
No, I agree. I guess the best way to say what I mean is that I definitely think that there is a line. I just don't know where it is. And it can vary depending on the specific.
I mean, I think also my question is predicated on the assumption that these traditional rituals themselves have not changed and are not changing, which of course is not true. So it's not as if they're taken and just reproduced blindly by each generation, but it is a rather thorny issue. Of course, there is such a long tradition also closer to us. I mean, this is what happens every Easter, right? With the rituals of crucifixion and the rehearsing of it in some societies, this in the Philippines, but they reenact the Passion of Christ. I also wanted to refer you to one short novella in this called The Interrogation. This is by Magdalene, who is talking about how people who have suffered from torture during the dictatorship, this particular character, then refuses to become emblematic of the heroism of the left, which is precisely what that rhetoric of heroism does, to create a common sense of experience and community among the veteran leftists. And he locates it right into Holy Week, where he says, I don't want my suffering to become a Christ-like suffering, which is a sadistic ritual. Anyway, there's an interesting conversation I'm saying about this question of sacrifice and suffering.
There's a man that worked with Paul Bloom, formerly here at Yale. He's now at the University of Toronto. So a psychologist who his latest book is about suffering and how we derive meaning from suffering. And he makes this distinction between voluntary suffering or chosen suffering and involuntary suffering. So there's a big difference there. But in both cases, he might argue that there's still a search for meaning. There's a need for the individual to say that, oh, this was not all for nothing. I suffered for some reason.
Effort.
Because it made me a better person, or because God wanted me, it has a path for me, or whatever you tell yourself. But we look for reasons for and meaning in our suffering.
Maria?
Yeah, just, we can talk about it later. Is there any difference between religious rituals and more secular rituals in terms of the suffering or the community participation, or would you make such a categorization?
So I think that ritual extends far beyond religion, predates religion. So a lot of what ritual does works independently of religion. Having said that, religion is very good at harnessing those social technologies that are rituals because it coats them with this layer of ideology. And this is why the other domains where you see very powerful team building rituals are other domains that also involve ideology. Things like state rituals, things like army rituals, things like sports rituals. So yes, ideology definitely adds an extra layer. And I think that ideology to a great degree needs ritual to survive. I think ritual predates religion, and you wouldn't have religion in the form that we define religion today without ritual.
You wouldn't define?
The way we define religion today, you wouldn't have it without rituals.
It wouldn't be recognized as religion, you mean?
No, I mean that action does a lot in order to reinforce belief.
Yes, I think one of the
internalize belief.
And one of the trends that we're observing is personalized religious convictions or assertions, I guess, that somebody is not religious, some spiritual, which usually to me signals that I'm not engaged with some religious community.
Yes.
And that's sort of what I'm hearing when I hear people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual.
Exactly. Some anthropologists, that's where they draw the line between religion and something else, whether you call that magic or something, whatever it is, or private religiosity. It's that you're part of a congregation.
Yes. I want us to continue the conversation, but I want to turn Zoom off because we're getting to a more informal mode, and thank everybody both who have been here and on Zoom. And also thank you, Tarana, for being our technical guru here. Dimitri, I want to thank you profusely, and we're going to continue this conversation once I turn off the Zoom, all right? Because it was a great talk. Let me see how can I do this. Tarana, you